Okay, so today I thought that I would talk about Anapanasati, which was the subject of our Sutta discussion yesterday. And I spoke with Mangala recently. We went to see a venue in the Cotswolds, the north part of the Cotswolds. And I asked him what he thought might be a nice theme. And he said, yeah, with Anapanasati, sometimes it's really hard to actually get into. It's not such an easy method, even though it's the method that the Buddha praised. And it's one of the methods that the Buddha generally dwelt in. He said he generally dwelt in Anapanasati before his enlightenment and both after his enlightenment. And in fact, it led to his abandoning of all the taints, in other words, to his complete liberation. So the method itself took him through the deep jhana states into deep wisdom. The last part of the Anapanasati Sutta is all concerned with wisdom and with how we direct a mind that has emerged from stillness, free from the hindrances, and direct it in a way that is conducive to the arising of insight. He also said that Anapanasati is to be cultivated for the overcoming. The word he used was upachedaya, which really means the cutting off of thoughts. So anapana meditation on the breath, when cultivated properly, will cut through the thinking mind and give us a lot of peace. One of the things we did yesterday actually was look at a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, which started off with a bit of a tragedy where many monks were practicing another kind of meditation, the meditation on the repulsive aspects of the body. And it actually led them to feeling so disgusted with their bodies that some of them ended up committing suicide. And the Buddha came out of seclusion after a couple of weeks' meditation of his own and remarked to his attendant, "The Sangha looks very diminished. What has happened here?" And the Venerable Ananda, his attendant, told him that the monks had been meditating in this way and become so distressed and disgusted and fed up with their own bodies that, they'd actually committed suicide. And as a response to that, the Buddha taught breath meditation and said that breath meditation is a pleasant and peaceful abiding. He called it an ambrosial pleasant abiding that disperses and quells unwholesome states on the spot. Does that happen for anyone here? Usually doesn't do that for me straight away, I have to admit. So how is this possible? How is it that the Buddha said we can expect these benefits? And yet so many of us struggle to be with the breath. So I wanted to have a look at this today and talk about how we can practice Anapanasati so that it does lead to great fruit and great benefit, as the Buddha promised that it would, because he doesn't use his words lightly, he doesn't mince his words. If he says it leads to great peace and great benefit, great fruit and great benefit, then clearly it does, and it did for him, and that's why we have the teachings today. So he starts off in the Anapanasati Sutta from the point where a person has gone to a forest, or to the foot of a tree, the root of a tree, or to an empty place. And then this person sits down, just as we all have done, cross-legged, with the body erect, and establishes mindfulness in front of them. So the word there is sati, how is it? Sati, I forget now. Having established mindfulness in front of one. Anyway, the Pali language, for some people, has led them to believe that means establishing mindfulness at the front of the nose or at the tip of the nose. But even Bhikkhu Bodhi now actually retranslates that and says it more likely means establishing mindfulness as a priority. So establishing mindfulness before becoming aware of the breath. So this is one clue as to what we might be missing by going straight into this practice, perhaps without establishing mindfulness sufficiently. And so one of the problems of this is that we're not able to stay with the breath. And we struggle with the breath, and it becomes more of a kind of dragging the breath back rather than actually being aware of the breath. And the whole meditation becomes a kind of drag. The breath goes away and we drag it back. It goes away again, we drag it back again. And I don't know if any of you have this problem, but my breath meditation for the first few years was like that. It was a kind of battle with the breath that didn't want to stay with me. And I was relieved when we would turn from the meditation on the breath to the meditation on the body, because my mind had somewhere else to establish itself. And looking back now, actually, I realized that what I was establishing by moving to the body awareness was mindfulness, stronger mindfulness. And after that, it was much easier to go back to the breath. But of course, the time was over by then. The meditation retreats used to start with Anapana and then go into kind of scanning the body and understanding its nature of impermanence. So that was the end of my breath meditation. So it didn't really work. So one of the problems is we come to these trees or empty places, just as you have today, but we haven't done the preliminaries. And there's a really nice story. I thought I'd share it because it sort of fits in and because it's a funny story that probably most of you have heard, but I really like this story. And it's about a group of monkeys. Does anyone know this? It's an Ajahn Brahm story. It's really nice. These monkeys, they're a little bit unscrupulous. So one day they go and raid a banana plantation. Monkeys like bananas. So they go out in a big gang and they say, come on, let's go and raid this plantation. But the banana plantation happens to be next to a monastery, just like Anukampa Grove. And perhaps the doors are open, I don't know. Maybe they're right out there and these doors are open. And then they hear the, let's say, senior nun talking about the monkey mind. And the monkeys are like, what? This is terrible. They're defaming us. Our minds are perfectly fine. What do they mean, the monkey mind, the monkey mind? They say it's bad. This is no good at all. So they get very upset, but they still steal the bananas. And then they go back to their monkey quarters, wherever that is, probably outside under a tree. And they say, okay, maybe they're right. What if we do have monkey minds? Let's try to meditate. They say you should meditate. So let's sit down and meditate. So they sit down and meditate and they say, okay, right leg over left leg, right paw, it's a hand actually. Somebody pointed out Ajahn Brahm made a mistake. He called it a paw, and actually they have hands, not paws. So anyway, right hand over left hand, back straight. What is it else? Eyes shut, watch the breath. So they start watching the breath. And after about one or two breaths, one of them, excuse me, I was thinking, before we meditate, we've got to peel the bananas first of all. We've got to eat the bananas, but we need to meditate. So, okay, let's peel them first of all. So they say, okay, yes. Okay, let's peel the bananas and then we can meditate. So they do that and then they sit down and go, okay, right leg over left leg, right hand over left hand, back straight, eyes shut, watch the breath. Excuse me, another monkey shouts. I was thinking, before we eat the bananas, we first have to gather them in front of us. So let's put the bananas in front of us. So then when we meditate, we can eat the bananas. Oh yeah, very good idea. Okay, let's bring the bananas and put them in front of us. Okay. Now let's try to meditate again. Right leg over left leg, right hand over right hand, back straight, eyes closed. Mindfully breathing in, mindfully breathing. Excuse me. I was thinking before we eat the bananas, we've got to put them in our mouths first of all. Oh yeah, good idea. Okay, let's put them in our mouths. So then they put them in the mouth, one in each mouth. Some monkeys had two, one even had three in their mouth. And then they closed their eyes, tried to meditate. But guess what happened? And they ate up all the bananas. And this is what happens when they have a monkey mind. So after that, they realize, oh dear, we actually do have a monkey mind and we're certainly not prepared for meditation. So one of the problems here, of course, is that the foundations were not in place. They were actually meditating with a lot of greed rather than with a sense of letting go and a sense of quietness in the mind and a sense of being prepared by having virtue. They'd also stolen bananas, right? They'd raided this plantation and bought far too many. So they didn't have good sila. And this is one of the problems. I was speaking to my friend Venerable Rebecca yesterday by Skype. First time I've spoken to her for months, actually, because she's really busy over in Perth now. Actually, Sydney. But yeah, because there's a shortage of bikini monasteries, she's also being asked to go here and go there. So I was encouraging her actually to do that. And she told me she'd just been listening to a talk by Bhante Sujato. And in that talk, he said that the problem with a lot of meditators is we start from the end and we work back and finally come to the start of the path, which means we start by discussing things like dependent origination, the nature of nibbana, jhanas and how to get into jhanas, etc., meditation, mindfulness. And then years later, we realize, oh, hang on, what about virtue? Didn't the Buddha say we have to start with virtue? Oh, and generosity. And so we gradually start building the foundations as our practice develops, because we start with the practice of meditation and all these, high-fluting ideas that we don't really know anything about. Whereas in Asian countries, and I'm not saying it's perfect, there's a lot of corruption, just like any other country, sometimes worse. I know in Sri Lanka there are a lot of monks, even in politics, not just they vote or something, they're actually in political parties. And, there's all kinds of scandals really in every society, including the monastic societies in some places. Human beings are human beings. Anyway, on the whole, practicing Buddhists in Asian countries have been brought up with the understanding of the importance of virtue and cultivating wholesome states. And because of this, before they start their meditation, there's already a degree of happiness, I would say, ensuing from living a fairly virtuous lifestyle. And also quite a lot of faith in the monastic sangha, but also faith in their own potential for awakening. There's a lot of confidence there that if they put the teachings of the Buddha into practice, the results will come. And so they start from a very different foundation. And my experience in Myanmar was certainly that the people seem to be able to still their minds very quickly and enter states of deep samadhi much more easily than most people brought up in Western cultures. And I was quite blown away by that. They didn't necessarily have the language or perhaps even the kind of education that encourages critical analysis, analytical thought. So we didn't talk a lot about the Dhamma, about the practice, about dependent origination, or even the benefits of practice very much. But they could make their minds really still. And it was the safest country I'd ever travelled in. Rather than sort of feeling I had to watch out for my stuff, they would watch out for me. You'd get on a bus and they'd say, don't worry, your stuff is safe. Not that I had very much, but there was just this sense that I could be completely free. And that was a very, very beautiful feeling, to be so safe in a country that I was visiting, obviously for the first time. So I wanted to, get you to think a little bit today about what brought you here. Because here you are with the trees outside. You're not under a tree right now, but you're in an empty place. This is what the Buddha meant, a place for meditation. What brought you here? How come you're ready to practice? Or are you ready to practice? And if so, what are some of those qualities that you've been developing in your lives? It's important for us to recognize this, to give ourselves a sense of encouragement. I don't know, what would you say? Can anyone answer these things? The kind of attitudes or motivations or qualities that we bring to the path that help you in your meditation. Any? Yeah?
I think the thing that started me off on the direction that led to coming here is it started from the concept of non-harming. When I was very, very young, maybe 5 or 6, I was eating a sausage,
Yeah.
and I got an image in my head of a pig, and I made the connection. So I spat it out, never ate meat again.
Yeah.
And then when I encountered Buddhism and found that it valued non-harming, including animals other than humans, I thought that's the thing for me.
Oh,
so it was
beautiful.
Non-harming that led me to be interested in meditation.
Yeah. Thank you. That's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. So you were coming from one of the right motivations, which is non-harming, avihimsaka, which literally means non-violence or non-harm. Yeah. Beautiful. Thanks. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think probably intense dissatisfaction would
Yeah.
be a motivator for me.
Yeah, great.
Realising that whatever you did
Uh-huh.
wasn't permanent
Mm.
and
Mm.
was still unhappy or dissatisfied at the end of it.
Yeah.
And the Buddha's path seems to offer a solution to that.
Yes. Yeah. 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 So it's interesting that both of you just basically pointed towards right view in your case and right motivation in yours, which are consequential actually of each other. So some sense of the suffering and basic dissatisfaction that we can't really find the happiness we're seeking from the things that are presented to us in our society. I had a very similar experience, thinking, okay, what is it that I can possibly do in this society that could bring me that happiness that I'm looking for, that sense of meaning? And I really couldn't. I tried to think of every possible thing I could do career-wise or service-wise, and I just thought this isn't going to solve the problem. And it did lead to a lot of dissatisfaction and almost despair in my teens. But luckily, after reading the teachings, I realized this is one of the first factors in a causal sequence that leads to seeking the Dhamma and developing confidence in the Dhamma, developing a beautiful, harmless attitude, really practicing out of a genuine concern and compassion for the welfare of all beings that keeps the mind bigger, it keeps the mind broad and less likely to fall into a kind of narcissistic type of spiritual path, which is all about me and what I can experience and, what kind of result the practice is going to give me. We're doing it for the benefit of others. So this is really beautiful. And I think, the suffering is one of the things I noted down here, just to remind myself of the sequence in the gradual training. So from suffering to confidence is often one of the sequences, or from virtue. Confidence and virtue kind of go together because we have to have a little bit of confidence in what the Buddha's saying and how he encourages us to develop wholesome states in order to start developing them and to continue developing them even when things are tough. And from that, we get a sense of non-remorse, non-regret. So we have a clear conscience. We feel good about our lives. And therefore, there's a certain amount of happiness in the mind, which the Buddha called blameless bliss, blameless happiness. Yeah. Does anyone recognize that? Blameless happiness. It's almost a lack of remorse, but it is a thing. There is a quality there that we can tap into if we try. Yeah. Karen, you were.
I raised my hand when you asked the question about blameless happiness.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to talk about that. It was more, I think I was looking for tools to regulate the emotional and physical impact of suffering.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was meditation, but I couldn't find a place that made it accessible for me. And I was just talking to Stephanie. I cannot work my way back how I came across Anukampa, yourself, Ajahn Brahm, but it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And everything else that you've said now is actually now opening up for me, that it's not the tool, but it's the way of looking at the suffering. And it's finding that place of stillness rather than unregulating myself down to stillness. It's actually what does that open up for me? That new perspective towards everything, towards being. So it's almost like I sort of was on this then narrow road, and now it's wow, this forest. I was looking for the
Beautiful.
tree, and now the forest has opened up.
Yeah, beautiful. So it's like a disposition, a sort of change in disposition to everything, and realizing that you can include everything in the practice. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, which is also, I think, one of the aspects that makes the Dhamma so universal. First we come because we want to solve our own problem of suffering, and finally we realize, or gradually we realize that, our suffering is basically part of being a human being, and it's universal. It's experienced universally. And the Buddha's teachings speak to that universal problem in a language we can all understand. So, yeah, thanks. It's a kind of paradigm shift, isn't it, when we start to realize that the problem is in our way of looking, and also can be solved through shifting that perspective on life. Yeah. So getting back to the sutta and just reflecting back to what we said in the beginning about how the Buddha taught anapanasati and the breath meditation, the mindfulness of breathing, as a way towards peace and as a sublime, ambrosial, pleasant abiding. It's clear that it's founded on happiness. There needs to be a foundation of a kind of happiness that is not perhaps a worldly happiness, but something that can allow us to be with our own minds. So there's a sense of well-being there. And then we go to this tree and we sit down cross-legged, and we don't start thinking about all the bananas we just stole and all the bananas we want to eat later, because we realize that the solution is not in the banana, but the solution is actually in developing a peaceful mind. And the next thing the Buddha says, the first instruction, do you know what the first instruction is in the Anapanasati Sutta after sitting cross-legged, which really means sitting comfortably and establishing mindfulness in front of ourselves as a priority? The next thing is mindful, one breathes in, mindful, one breathes out. And this is a really important point to understand the language here. It never says, watch the breath. The Buddha just says, Satova assasati, Satova passasati. It basically means mindful, one breathes in, mindful, one breathes out. So we've established some mindfulness first of all. And that is also a huge kind of area that we can exploit, if you like, or that we can cultivate, because the Buddha isn't going through a step-by-step how to establish mindfulness in this particular sutta, but he does it in other suttas. Also in the Satipatthana Sutta, there's a huge exposition of mindfulness based on the body, based on the mind, based on the mental qualities. And one of the methods that I used in my early practice, as I've said, is mindfulness of the body, really becoming clear about the feelings in the body, but also later on in my practice, understanding the importance of infusing that awareness with kindness. So again, making sure the way that I'm aware, my disposition towards everything I do, is lined up with those three right motivations, the second factor of the path, which are a natural response to suffering. So for anyone who's not aware, or just to bring that point again, those three right motivations are non-ill will, avyapada, and nekama, a sense of giving or letting go. So it's the opposite of greed. It's generosity, it's being kind, it's letting go, not searching for results, but giving to the practice. And lastly, avihimsaka, which is the non-harm again, which for me means being incredibly gentle and also patient with my body and mind. So we establish that mindfulness in these ways. And then mindful we breathe in, mindful we breathe out. So there's a sense of a background awareness, and this is not a thing or something unconditional or anything like that. Mindfulness is just an aspect of the mind, which is also conditioned, fortunately, because we can condition it to be very gentle, very loving, friendly towards what we experience. And then we allow the breath into the mind. So we breathe in, we breathe out with that mindfulness. The next stage in the Anapanasati Sutta is to notice whether the breath is long or short. So whether the in-breath is long, whether the out-breath is long or short, to try to gain more interest in the breath, to try to encourage the mind to take an interest. So we can actually ask ourselves, if we're getting a bit dull, okay, is the breath long? Is it short? Is it somewhere in between, right? Just to know what's happening and to start to sense the whole of the breath. We can also use other means, like, is the breath coming in colder than the breath going out? Usually it is. Usually the breath coming out is slightly warmer because it's been through the body. So this is a way of, again, establishing more mindfulness along with the breathing. And in all of these first four, the Buddha's, again, not saying watch the breath. He's using the verb pajanati, which means one knows. So breathing in a long breath, one knows they're breathing in a long breath. Breathing in a short breath, one knows they're breathing in a short breath. And then breathing in, one knows the whole of the breath? Yeah. So one knows the whole of the breath is the third one. And this is starting to be aware of more of the breath. So rather than just knowing the kind of vague breath and whether it's coming in or going out, we start to be able to stay with that whole breath. And I really like this stage because I feel it's a nice stage to bring in some of those warm qualities and develop certain perceptions that allow me to stay with the breath longer. So, for example, you could even imagine that the mind is sort of stroking the breath. When it comes in, you're just very gently kind of caressing the breath, or the breath is stroking the mind. I remember one perception I had one year in my rains retreat, which was almost that each breath that was coming in was like polishing my mind. And there were like these little beings that were coming and kind of just cleaning up the mind. And whenever my mind would disappear for a while and forget what it was doing, the breath would be so happy to have it back again whenever it came back. So the breath was, oh, great, we get a chance to shine up the mind. And it was just a perception that really helped me to kind of make that sense of intimacy, develop a sense of intimacy and friendship with the breath. Yeah. You can also sometimes see it as kind of rubbing the breath. And that is one of the descriptions of vichara in the Visuddhimagga, I think. So vitakka is the initial interest in the breath, or the initial pointing to the breath. So we are aware of whether the breath is coming in or going out, and the mind just kind of keeps on directing its awareness to that breath initially, but not for too long. And then as that continues, it starts to sustain itself, and that's called vichara. The other simile there is like vitakka, where the mind just touches the breath. It is like the ring, the kind of initial strike of the gong, like that. And vichara is the ring of the gong. So it stays with the breath for longer. And the breath can become very smooth at this time, and almost like a resting place for the mind. I sometimes have another perception, which I quite like, of the breath being like this soft pillow that I can rest on. So you can bring in a lot of these sort of perceptions that engender a sense of contentment and friendliness towards the breath. Contentment is also a beautiful quality, to be content with just a single breath. It seems very humble, very kind of maybe not so interesting at first, but as we develop genuine contentment with the fact that right now we can just breathe and we can be aware of that breath and allow the mind to just relax, slowly we start to see the breath as something quite beautiful. And also it gives the breath the chance to calm down. So the next stage in the breath meditation is that the breath becomes tranquil. Yeah. So in all of these stages, we simply know what's happening. We're not doing anything at all. We're just establishing mindfulness, staying with that wholesome attitude and allowing the breath to enter the mind. And if the breath doesn't want to stay with you, instead of going and dragging it back again, perhaps we just cultivate the preliminary parts of the path. Bring up more happiness in your mind. Relax the body more deeply. Practice with mindfulness of the body for longer, and there'll come a point where there's enough silence in the mind, there's enough settling of the mind, that the breath starts to come to you. And when it comes, your mind's ready for it. It's like a container that is able to receive a subtle and beautiful object like the breath and actually recognize its value. Yeah, because sometimes we dismiss it as something really boring, really kind of dull. And that's simply because we don't have enough beauty and happiness in our mind. Have you ever noticed that when you're happy, everything looks beautiful? Even things that usually look kind of miserable and depressing, like a kind of grey and drizzly day, there's a certain beauty in that when the mind is full of gratitude, or when something wonderful is happening in your life. At the moment, for me, everything's wonderful because the monastery is developing well and I'm seeing people benefit from what we've established here, and having a lot of opportunity to reflect on how far we've come. And even if I'm tired and should be kind of grumpy, it's very hard to get grumpy when there's good people around me making me cups of chai. So, the whole world is coloured by the quality, the state of our mind. And as we realize this, we gave much more attention to the state, the qualities of our mind, and start realizing that the objects of our mind don't have really any particular inherent value. They're not particularly beautiful, they're not particularly ugly, but it's what we bring to them that makes all the difference. Does this make sense? So I'll go a little bit further because I want us to do some meditation, but the next stage in the breath meditation is really important. So if we've approached it in this way, through the gradual training, and again, breath meditation is sort of the later end of the path, then the breath meditation develops by taking us through increasingly refined experiences of happiness that comes from within. And so the next part of breath meditation is the feeling part. The first part is related to the first satipatthana of body awareness, and the second part is related to feeling or vedana. And this is all to do with pleasant feeling. And it's interesting because the first two here are breathing in, one experiences piti. So the verb changes. Now it's not one knows the breath coming in or out, but one experiences. So one experiences piti, which means rapture, or sometimes people translate that as bliss. Rapture's quite nice because you can have a kind of rapt attention with something. And this is what starts to happen. The breath starts to actually delight the mind. You become really interested in it because it's, giving the mind that ability to rest. And as the mind gradually relinquishes thinking, the energy starts to build. As the energy builds, there's more joy in the mind, there's more mindfulness, you see more of the breath, and you start to feel that you can really enjoy the whole process. You don't need to hold on anymore. So we start to experience this piti, and usually this starts in the body, or it could be connected to your breath. It depends whether you're particularly honed in on the breath or whether you have more of an expansive awareness at this time. And then from the piti, we experience sukha, which is usually translated as happiness, but I quite like the translation contentment for sukha, because it's a much more durable happiness. It's something a lot more reliable than the happiness of the senses, the happiness we have in our day-to-day life. It's coming again from inside, and it's the result of piti. So it's a kind of gradual deepening and quietening and establishing, in a way, of that piti. So the two go together. They're not usually easy to separate at this point. They go together. And this is pre-jhana. But then that sukha continues and becomes more mental. So the next point in the breath meditation is called chitta sankhara, which means the formation, the mind formation or the mental formation. And it really means the experience of piti and sukha as a mind object at this stage. So the body starts to disappear a little bit into the background as we continue to sustain our attention on the breath, or let's say as the breath continues to enjoy hanging out in the mind, in our mind. And we start to give more and more of our energy to that one object and start to get really interested in it. A lot of delight coming up in the mind. Yeah. So the feeling of piti sukha starts to become, I don't really like the word disembodied. Ajahn Brahm uses it, but I think it can sometimes make us feel like we're floating away. It just means that your emphasis, your attention is not so much on the body anymore, but it's more on the feeling of the breath. It's more on the mental perception, if you like, of the breath. And again, this leads to tranquility. So the whole thing starts to calm down, and we get greater and greater ease with this until the point in our meditation when the breath starts to be represented as a mental object in the form perhaps of a light or a kind of very subtle experience that we may relate to a physical feeling, but is different from that. It's much more refined, much subtler than that. And this is where the mind's really starting to collect. It's really starting to enjoy the process, and the mind is getting very, very empowered and very bright. So this is how gradually the breath meditation leads into deep meditation, into samadhi states. And the rest of the sutta talks about that, about gladdening the mind, about, well, actually at this stage, Ajahn Brahm would say that this refers to the light nimitta usually, or lights that can arise in the mind, or any kind of symbol. Usually it's a light, but it could be a physical feeling that's not really physical. It's quite subtle to talk about. But its defining qualities are its stability and its beauty. So it's a mental object that's very stable, very, very beautiful, very powerful, and that starts to almost envelop you. And gradually the five senses start to recede, the body starts to fade from your awareness, and the mind enters these deep states of samadhi, where it really takes a very deep rest and is completely free at that time from the five hindrances. So the five hindrances are fully overcome. So this is the kind of trajectory we're talking about with breath meditation. So you can see that it starts from, the kind of ordinary, fairly coarse breath, but then becomes more and more refined, so that the Buddha's leading us on to noticing the qualities of the breath, and then the actual happiness that arises with it. And the happiness starts to become our main object as breath meditation progresses. And bit by bit, the breath itself will disappear. By the stage of the nimitta, the breath might be present alongside it, but usually, again, it's in the background, and it just becomes a mind object. So it's not really breath anymore. Even the perception of in and out starts to fade, and the mind becomes unified, the mind becomes stilled. So this is quite a lot to talk about, but I hope that I've given a kind of generalized picture about the potential of breath meditation, and also the importance of the foundations. And it's not as though this is a linear path and we develop the foundations, we've either got the foundations there or we haven't, we're either ready to start or we're not. We continue to develop those foundations throughout the path. And they go hand in hand, like many of you've beautifully expressed here. As your practice matures, you realize that the path is actually, It's three-dimensional, it's holistic. And the qualities that we develop on the cushion need to be expressed and start becoming expressed in everything we do in our lives. The way we speak, the way we regard others, the way we relate to others. Our motivations for what we do start to become refined. We start to find joy in the goodness of our lives, in being kind. And we can't get enough of being kind. And this is really important, especially if you get to the second stage of Anapana. Some people, often, for most people, it will happen sometimes. We might be able to stay with the breath. We may be aware of the incoming breath, the outgoing breath, even the whole length of the breath. In Burma, they used to say asa, ale, aso. So they used to say, to get you onto the whole breath, the length of the breath, they'd say the beginning, middle, and end of the breath. So you'd be aware of three places, and then gradually the whole breath. And then we can get to the point where the breath tranquilizes. But sometimes people reach a bit of a point there where it sort of tapers off because there's not quite enough joy in the mind. So you can get peaceful, but then you start to drift. There's just not quite enough oomph in the mind. And this, again, is often because we haven't developed enough joy, or we've neglected to notice the joy that is there, but we've kind of dismissed because it's not what we expect it to be. It's something a little bit subtler, maybe, than what we would think of as bliss. So when this happens, another really skillful means, which I should have mentioned, is to develop a sense of loving kindness to the breath. So it's another perception. I've talked about a few, like giving to the breath, being friends with the breath, being creative with the way you experience the breath, sort of purifying the mind. We can develop contentment with the breath, but we can also develop loving kindness with the breath, which can even mean taking the breath as an object of your loving kindness, almost as though it's a little being that's coming in that needs your attention. And you really have this feeling that this breath is looking after me, gratitude to the breath as well. And one of the methods I've been using a lot in retreats, especially because I do tend to find that the mind can become peaceful with the breath and it can develop some joy with the breath. But because of all my extensive Vipassana training, I'm a little bit like, yeah, so just be equanimous with the joy. I don't know. It's like, yeah, it's peaceful, it's nice, happy, whatever. So what I try to do, and then of course it starts to fade. So what I often do is do a lot of loving kindness as a practice, as a main practice. And then when my mind is so soaked through with loving kindness, I gradually allow the words to fade and the breath to come to the mind. And the mind is so imbued with loving kindness that the breath, it's just a delightful place to be. It's a really delightful place to be. And it's so easy. It's just there. And it's almost a relief to stay with because it's quieter than the loving kindness. It's a quieter kind of joy. So make sure you keep on cultivating joy, and that will bring you a lot of success in breath meditation. And of course, the virtue and everything else we've discussed.